Hello, everyone. So I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Klaudia Lee today from the best city in the world, Hong Kong. She will be our first keynote speaker, and she's currently associate professor at the Department of English, City University of Hong Kong. And she's the author of Charles Dickens in China, 1895 to 1915, Cross-Cultural Encounters from 2017. And most recently, just from February, actually, Spatial Stories and Intersecting Geographies, Hong Kong, Britain, and China, 1890 to 1940, from Liverpool University Press. Now, Spatial Stories examines literary and journalistic connections between Hong Kong, China, and Britain, and accesses archives that previously have not received much attention. And as you can tell, this book will be of much interest to members of RSVP. She, as if that's not enough, she's also co-editor of World Literature Approaches, Practices, and Pedagogy, which will be released in just a few weeks in July. And she's currently working on two other projects. The first is on literary engagement with archives and archiving from the 19th century to the present day. And the second is a co-edited volume on cities and fantasy across cultures from 1830 to 1930. She is also an executive council member of the Society for Global 19th Century Studies and a co-convener of Transnational Urban Narratives Network. And I want to pause here and emphasize the Transnational Urban Networks network, particularly because it hosts reading groups online and also conferences, including one in December around the topic of urban mediations. So if you're interested in becoming more involved in this, if you're interested in sort of urban topics, Klaudia is keen to recruit new members with backgrounds in the 19th century to that. She also has a Master's of Arts and a Doctor of Philosophy and English Literature from the University of Nottingham in the UK, and a journalism and communication degree from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Particularly exciting for us is that not only does she work on periodicals scholarly, but she also has a past in newspapers. Prior to pursuing a career in academia, she worked as a journalist. In that capacity, she covered a variety of news and feature stories in China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And this experience very much shapes her approach to her scholarly work in the interface between journalism and literature. So today, please join me in welcoming Klaudia to give the talk called Periodicals, Voices, and the Making and Unmaking of Literary Histories. And I'll hand it over to Klaudia.
Thank you for, hi. Thank you very much, Jessica. Can you hear me all right? Sorry, I just want to check. Okay, thank you, great. So I just, before I show the PowerPoint, I just want to thank, of course, first of all, Jessica for the really kind, generous introductions. And yeah, Jessica and I actually met in different parts of the world. So I think we kind of testify to the transnational connection related to the association as well. And I'm deeply honored to have the opportunity to share my thoughts on research at this year's RSVP annual conference. And I would like to thank the RSVP President, Priti Joshi, and the Executive Committee and the Conference Program Committee for the invitation. I'm very sorry I'm unable to attend the conference in person. And I would like to thank Kari and the technical support team for making it possible for me to give this talk online. Just to mention, as I prepare for today's talk, I have also reflected on the different connections that I forged with RSVP, either directly or indirectly. Seems actually is something that I've never mentioned. I first knew about the organization when I was a PhD student in the UK. And it was, as Jessica mentioned, is actually a transitional moment for me from transitioning as a journalist to become a kind of learning to become an academic. So it was a huge surprise at that point for me to realize there's an organization actually really promotes and also really asks a lot of questions about periodicals. And I was actually working in an English language newspaper in Hong Kong before. So I think it's particularly close to my professional and research interest. My first article on periodicals in Hong Kong was also published in Victorian Periodicals Review under the editorship of Alexis Easley, actually quite a number of years ago. And that piece has been to me to a really important point of entry to the field of periodical studies. And of course, in recent years, I've also been a regular kind of watcher of YouTube channel run by RSVP. So I really appreciate the association's, efforts to make it, available a wide range of resources, for academic space in different parts of the world. And I also want to thank the RSVP former president, Fenula Dinant, actually, who's been getting me involved in online workshops and edited volumes. So all these actually reflections and experience really informed a lot of my thinking about periodicals. Okay, and of course, a lot of your work, a lot of people in this room whose work I've also admired and learned from the years as well. I just want to mention that. And so now I'm going to share a PowerPoint that actually, I hope you can see it. All right, let me see. I hope it's clear. It's the cover slide of my talk. So the topic that I've chosen today reflects a few strands of my research and professional interests that Jessica mentioned. And it also offers an opportunity for me to reflect on the entwinement of histories, print histories, and literary histories in colonial context. Hence the brackets that I use for the word literary and histories in the plural in the title. It's also related to the fact that my primary research interests are illustrated journals, literary magazines, and creative writings published in newspapers. But in this talk, I would like to situate my discussion more broadly. And so I will also, I will show you some images from other blog sheets, daily newspapers and weekly as well. So I also realized that I've proposed a rather broad topic, so I would like to mention that the examples that I draw on will mainly be periodicals and creative works published in Hong Kong from the mid-19th to the early 20th centuries, though I will also situate my discussion with the broader English and Chinese print worlds. In periodicals of Queen Victoria's Empire and Exploration, Convent and Van Estel started off with an observation that I believe many of us studying Victorian periodicals would readily share. The 19th century Britain was still really the age of the periodical. It's also shown that the circulation of periodicals and newspapers was wider and more influential than that of those in Victorian society. But they also raise important questions. The question which occurs to the student of empire is whether or not this was equally true in Britain's colonies. Did the custom of periodical publication follow the colonialists to their new lands? And if so, was this literature as pervasive and as important as it was in Britain? What functions did periodicals serve in colonial life? Nearly 3 decades had passed since this exploratory study was published, and that more attention had been paid to areas and places that might at that point receive little attention. The challenges that I mentioned in the book, including accessibility to archives, such as the lack of system in selected regions and areas, the difficulty faced by researchers as they try to navigate various periodicals published in different languages remain, despite the various digitalizations and collaborative efforts. Of course, there are also questions that we may want to consider, such as other possible frameworks that we can use to analyze periodicals that can go beyond what I would describe as the influence, reception, and adaptation model that's often been used to explore colonial periodicals. Part of the challenges in addressing these issues, I think, is because as Victorianists, I myself included, we tend to focus on periodicals published in English language within a historical time frame that corresponded with British literary history, specifically, of course, the reign of Queen Victoria. And yet, in a lot of colonial and semi-colonial societies, they might follow different developmental path and historical time frame. The context of the emergence of specific periodicals might also be different, even though they were in various ways connected to the British Empire and its legacy. And of course, in bilingual or multilingual societies, the impact of a particular journal written in a specific language might also have different scale of reach and influence in a particular society. At a time when we seek to reflect on some of the approaches and theoretical assumptions underpinning Victorian periodical studies and consider ways to diversify the field, Hong Kong offers a unique case study. And I think it's kind of nice to just show you a map. So here is where I am now, Hong Kong here, and then here, of course, is where you are. Hong Kong is a unique case study as it's a periodical culture, both resonant with, yet also departed from some of the prevailing assumptions about Victorian periodicals. And how does we understand the idea of inference, reach, and circulation, for example? It's because while it was the British colony from 1842 to 1997, and that English was the sole official language until 1974, when the government declared both Chinese and English were official languages, English is not really, has never been a so-called everyday language used by most of the population. His first language was Chinese. Even though, of course, all the schooling, a lot of the English is actually the medium of instruction in schools. And thus what emerged were the paralleled and non-intersecting plain words across linguistic divides. So while English language periodicals played a key role in shaping British and international communities' perceptions of the city from the 19th century to the present day, the influence of English language periodicals on local populations remained limited within the city, especially during the period of our discussion. This effect, however, was seldom acknowledged explicitly by editors and journalists of illustrated magazines and literary journals in the period that are examined, who often blamed the lack of a readership with shared literary taste as reasons behind the failure of some of the endeavors to establish periodicals in the city. And so in today's talk, I'm going to divide my lecture into 3 parts. In the first part, periodicals as infrastructure, making place, and culture, I will draw on the recent theorization of infrastructure in arts and humanities to discuss the effects that the infrastructure of periodicals produce, especially in relation to acts of placemaking or making culture, as it were, and dialectically as of unmaking them. In the second part, simultaneous voices, alternative visions, I will discuss how creative works published in periodicals can critique colonial societies, though at the same time, they also seek a literary and journalistic lineage with their British counterparts in order to establish their literary authority. And in the last part, reading across and beyond Victorian periodicals, I will discuss how as the reading beyond Victorian periodicals can potentially, I suppose, bring periodicals published in different themed worlds across space and time in productive dialogues. The conference theme, Voices and Visions, indeed captures some of the key features of periodicals. The infrastructure of the periodicals, from its layouts, placement of diverse news and miscellaneous items, editorials, advertisements to their organization and structures, are often intended to convey specific visions of the place, places, communities, cultures, local and global interactions, as well as the various forms of relationship that might be explicitly or implicitly conveyed under the facet of multiplicities and heterogeneity as embodied in the periodical form. As we consider the voices that are being represented, we also, of course, need to think about not only their opposites, the silence, the absence, but also questions of competing voices that the periodicals may or may not capture. Of course, as researchers of periodicals, we often mainly focus on what we can see in terms of the visual and written elements on the pages, or is much less apparent is the level of autonomy that individual journalist or editor may have in deciding on the angle of the piece of writing or the amount of space or position that each item can occupy. And later today, I will discuss one of the very few instances where the competition for control and voice had been made explicit within the pages of a newspaper, the China Mail. To treat periodicals as a form of infrastructure is to consider not only the different networks and structures in organizational, institutional, and financial terms that some media theorists have discussed, but also the different invisible relationships and connections the infrastructure engenders and constraints. John Bingham Hall and Adam Kaiser in Making Cultural Infrastructure have a very thoughtful reflections on the notion of infrastructure, especially in relation to the idea of connections and relationships. Infrastructure is meant to remain invisible, or that is even when highly present, like roads, which are visible everywhere. Infrastructural systems are meant to enable rather than be seen necessarily as a thing in and of themselves. Roads are not roads, they are connections. And let's just jump to the last line. Or rather, roads are roads and electricity is power station, but as infrastructure, they are their effects. Of course, we are handling the highly visible forms of periodicals, but it's also worthy of noting that from readers' perspective, they may not often be aware of how the parts and the underpinning infrastructure constitutes the whole and the effects on the perception of a particular community and culture. In this sense, then, Laurent Bernard's theorization of infrastructure could help illuminate further how infrastructure has a symbiotic relationship, or perhaps even interchangeable relationship with mediation. Infrastructure then is another way of talking about mediation, but always as a material process of binding, never merely as a material technology as that genre, form, or norm that achieves something. Mediation is not a stable thing, but a way of seeing the unstable relations among dynamically related things. I just stop here. Because the line that I want to kind of focus on a bit more is the notion that mediation is not a stable thing, but a way of seeing the unstable relations among dynamically related things. Because to me, I think this is of particular relevance to the various forms of racial and spatial boundaries that were constantly enacted, reenacted, shifted, or transgressed at specific moments in history. Materials that were published in periodicals were often subject to various forms of mediations and reassembling. As such, they both enable and inhibit, reveal, and conceal. And of course, as researchers of periodicals of the past, which I will also briefly mention later, infrastructures can also be understood as the archival system that we use to document, present, and curate the periodicals that shaped our contemporary understanding of the past and the broader media landscape. Hong Kong was often constructed as a place of contradictions and Victorian periodicals. In earlier reports in England, it was constructed as a place of absence, that is, absence of local culture and voices, and as always, as the place of transit from Britain to China. As shown in this very widely cited, I think, piece published in Household Words in June 1851, titled Our Phantom Ship, China. I will only read out the first line or so, first couple lines. This is rather a common textual construction of the city before, the engagement is mainly focusing Hong Kong as an entrepot. Hong Kong was one of the upshores of our cannonading in the pure and holy Chinese War, and as for the new town of Victoria, we shall walk out of it at once, for we have not travelled all this way to look at Englishmen. And of course, the rest of the piece is talk about, how kind of the so-called barren land that has a recurrent colonial constructions, in a lot of reports of the time. And yet I would say that in the later part of the 19th century, perhaps a more recurrent representational strategy is the juxtaposition of the city's status as a British colony and international entrepot, and the modern city as encapsulated in, I think it's quite a striking image. Because for those of you who've been to Hong Kong, this is probably one of the most, or you may not have been to Hong Kong, but you may have received some brochure and paintings and those kind of things. And I think even today, like the tram line bringing tourists from Central to the Peak, or the panorama, or the overview, of the Victoria Harbour, are some of the recurrent images that are still being invoked today, because these are some of the most iconic images. So the contrast as a kind of rhetorical or representational strategy is the modernized or Western parts of the city as encapsulated in these advertisements, as contrast to the image. Sorry, it might not be very clear to you because this is actually printed like this, it's kind of in a vertical mode. It's actually the one's place truck area Taiping Shan or maybe I use Cantonese Taiping Shan in Hong Kong. So this is quite notorious for the very crowded, unhygienic kind of live condition back in 1894 or before. And this is the opening or the inaugural issue of Odds and Ends, an illustrated magazine conducted by blogger who's actually born in Macau and then moved to Hong Kong. This magazine is really interesting because it's one of the earlier illustrated magazines published in Hong Kong from 1896 to 97, but it's of course not the first one. Um, so what I would like to highlight is from moving from the so-called contrast between the modern city, the modern development as contrast with the crowded, the local headquarters, moving from that idea of the modernizing urban planning to print modernity that has also been framed as part of the British colonial projects in the city, and one which being shared by quite a lot of journalists and editors of the time. I'm not going to read out this just the advertisement. I just transcribe it from the advice to tourists, so you can actually see. I think yeah, so the tram line is one of the very recurrent images. So what I want to pause a little bit more is actually here. This is also from the same issue. Is talk about the editorial notes in the inaugural issue. Because I think the word may be a bit too small for you for those of you in the room. So I kind of transcribe it. So it's the same editorial notes. Because I think it's kind of worthwhile to reflect on this as it really set the tone of a lot of the printed materials that were launched in Hong Kong in the second half of the 19th century. So I will read out a part of it. I highlight in yellow and also the first kind of paragraph here. Represent to our readers the first number of odds and ends and illustrated by monthly magazine. We are not certain of ultimately achieving success in an undertaking in which all our predecessors have failed. We feel rather discouraged by the futile attempts which have at times been made to establish an illustrated paper in the colony. The China Magazine, the China Punch, and the Magpie have successively made their appearance amongst us, and for a time they seemed to fulfill the hopes of the promoters. Those hopes, however, were not destined to be realized, and after a short career, all the three papers have disappeared from circulation. And then I just jump to the bottom here. But progress in Europe and progress in the East in this respect have not been concurrent. In the one country, of course, it refers to England, the arts, and in particular, that pleasing branch of it, the graphic art, has approached a state profession, as contrast with the primitive methods, in China. So it's the way rhetorical framing, of the journal that also, as I mentioned, closely related to the idea of print modernity that was being kind of introduced in Hong Kong, or introduced or promoted, I suppose, in Hong Kong of the time. And one of the magazine here, I'm sure quite a few of you in the room today actually knew about is China Punch, right? This is one of the most iconic images of China Punch. The reason why it attracted a lot of attention as compared to Ocean's, of course, is because of its association with the Punch magazine in England. And of course, Punch also have this kind of transnational journey, right? Melbourne Punch and some other kind of Punch magazine appear in different parts of the world. So a similar rhetoric on the lead to bring the city's periodical culture up to the level as expected from the English reading public had again been used in a review by Far Eastern Press on the launch of another weekly. I'm aware that I'm drawing on a range of materials today, so I just want to show a broader picture of periodicals. In the last part, I will zoom in more on the kind of literary side of it. So this is actually a self-titled weekly post. The cover page is called Illustrated because actually inside the paper, there's also quite a few photos, images that have been used. Here in the East, we have no weekly newspaper. And I just jump a few lines. It is the duty of the newspaper proprietor, as is the aim of the newspaper editor, to provide something more comprehensive, more permanent, more leisurely in its conception than the daily sheet. Such a journal, if honorably conceived, judiciously constructed, and prudently controlled, should earn the respect and the support of the best classes in the community. If print culture and by extension periodical culture is often seen as a modernity project, periodicals such as these weekly posts have made it clear that it was the so-called best classes in the community, which I believed are referred to colonialist elites, expatriates, and people of influence that shared the empire vision who were their target readers, that the front page of the weekly post had been devoted to a section called Our Mutual Friend. I'm not sure whether you can see it. is actually the title of the column here called Our Mutual Friend. Also seemed to have drawn on their target readers' knowledge of Dickens' novel of the same name. Or maybe I'm thinking too much, but I believe that there's a certain kind of literary lineage here. Seems to me that try to implicitly establish a literary lineage with a popular writer in Britain. This Our Mutual Friend column introduces popular American and British writers of the time, including actually Mark Twain, George Meredith. And the Weekly Post also had Christmas issues that projected Dickens as the embodiment of Christmas spirits of charity and benevolence. Such a reliance on British writers to establish authority in periodical press was a usual strategy in Anglophone periodicals in Hong Kong in the long 19th century, reflecting the assumption of an imagined community with shared literary interest and taste. Yeah, of course, it's too simple a statement to make if we claim that Anglophone periodicals were purely engines of British imperial projects and visions, in the sense that I think there's also some kind of critique and dissenting voices that being included in a lot of different newspapers and periodicals. And as I mentioned earlier, one of my major interests is actually creative works published in periodicals. And I do believe that they have a particular role to play by including alternative voices that could comment on or review the tension, features, and gaps in colonial society. That some of the creative works occupy what I would describe as the liminal spaces of newspapers and periodicals could potentially give the writers a greater sense of creative freedom because they were not often being seen as an integral part to the newspaper identity or editorial direction. For example, poems or satirical short proses often serve as fillers, while it was not unusual for short stories to be published as supplements. A good example here, and it's one of my favorite actually for a lot of the works that I read, is a poem published in the China Mail on 29th September 1894. It heavily critiqued the colonial government's handling of the outbreak of the bubonic plague that first broke out in Hong Kong in May 1894. The death toll rose from 450 in May to over 2,400 in July that year. And so here I just want you to show you the full page. It's on China Mail and it's actually here. It's quite a nice location, in terms of newspaper, right? Usually it's in the top and also the kind of more either in the middle or right-hand corner, and usually capture, the audience attention. So I just read out maybe a bit of it. I don't know whether you can see very clearly, maybe the words a bit small. Where is now the place so deadly that is blot as bitter woe, causing crowds to quit our city till our trade bade fair to go? Shall we lead no more the matches? Shall we war in Sandy Bay? Has Black Death forever wandered far away? I want to kind of read out the last stanza. They would patch, cement, and cover all the infected areas over, make a new thing from an old. Touch up teasel, call it gold. This a visionary scheme that leads dollar-saving dream, but it won't kill the gem. It won't the plate gem kill. Nature will be nature still. So basically, the debate here is whether to burn it. The place that is burned typing Shan, the whole place, as the poem suggests, would have been too costly a move to take. Yet to patch, cement, and cover all the infected areas over is but a least dollar savings dream that would never kill the gem, but to allow for its proliferation. In many ways, this poem, I think, raises broader questions about the constructed nature of a place and its vulnerability, as well as the economic considerations that underlie many of the decision-making processes in the development of colonies. While Anglophone newspapers and journals were keen on foregrounding their connections with English newspapers in England and drawing on the cultural prestige of the popular authors of the time, they at times also painted a satirical portrait of the depiction of the city in English papers from afar. In one of the regular satirical columns in the China Mail called Flagrant Waters Murmur, Flagrant Waters, of course, is actually referred to it's kind of an English translation, I suppose, of the Chinese name of Hong Kong, that is Hong Kong, that is Fragrant Waters Murmur, which purportedly offers an insider's point of view from Hong Kong. So this, you can see, is actually occupy quite, a very large amount of space, on this particular page. And I think the word may be a bit small, so I kind of just capture the first two kind of stanza, I suppose, of these quite a long satirical kind of works here. That the pictures in the home papers actually refers to papers published in England about the Hong Kong plague, were occasionally recognizable, having been taken in some instances on the spot. And then the second one is actually the key that I want to mention, that the efforts of the English pictorials to invent drawings by eyewitnesses may be gratefully accepted by the masses of readers at home, although they produce a curly smile from the residents of Hong Kong. This reference to home papers reports on plague was reflective of the close connection between Hong Kong and British papers and the existence of a transnational readership. And indeed, it was not unusual for British newspapers to use the imagery of the Black Death when discussing the situation in Hong Kong during the epidemic. And this actually also showed, the transnational, or even if you think about, the target audience of the English newspaper in Hong Kong and those in England, you can also argue that there's kind of imagined communities in Benedict Anderson's terms in relation to Anglophone periodicals in Hong Kong as well. Creative works like these, I think, have pierced the veil of imperial glory and the success of British imperial projects by pinpointing the various self-interested motives that sometimes lied behind colonial authorities' decision. At the same time, and with periodicals' proximity with people's everyday life, they also serve as an accurate reminder of the intimate relationship between colonial policy and individual lives and responses. Yet, despite voices of satire and at times dissent, the perspectives of these narratives frequently remained limited to colonialist expatriate communities, traders, and to a less extent, Chinese bilingual elites of the time. So this is my last part, but it's also the kind of a longer one, reading across and beyond Victorian periodicals. In Cities in Motion, Urban Life and Cosmopolitanism in Southeast Asia, 1920 to 1940, Celine Lewis observes that amid the long-standing multilingual oral cultures of the port city, linguistic divisions were certainly made sharper through print, giving a growing community of literary Asians a deeper connection to those with whom they shared a language. And of course, I'm aware of the time frame is kind of beyond a bit of the long 19th century or Victorian period. And that her book also focused on Penang, Rangoon, and Bangkok. But I think her observations are equally applicable to various Asian port cities, including Hong Kong. In the period that I examined, that is from mid-19th to the early 20th centuries, the English and the Chinese language print worlds seldom intersected. And it was obvious that they drew on different readership and cultural and national frames of reference. Even by simply looking at, this is quite a, sorry, because I think that, yeah, let me do this so I can see more clearly. Oh, okay, so maybe I move a bit. So even by simply looking at the presentation of the days, actually you can get a glimpse of the different frameworks of reference and the target audience. The first one on the top is actually the first Chinese newspaper established in Hong Kong that was run and financed by Chinese in 1874. It's called Universal Circulating Parade, and it's actually using the calendar based on the reign of the Qing Emperor. So I use Cantonese, sorry, okay. So it's the Qing dynasty's kind of calendar that is using. And then in the middle is the Hong Kong Telegraph. It's using, of course, the normal kind of not normal, but kind of the calendar that we all kind of familiar with. And then the last one here in the bottom, the China Mail, the one that I'm going to talk a bit more, is actually using the bilingual version, which I think is kind of interesting, including both the Western and the lunar calendars. And there's also the translation, the Chinese translation of the so-called Western calendars, and which to me actually signifies its intention to engage with local and international readers. Okay, I move that. This editorial direction is also reflected by its decision actually to publish a Chinese language newspaper every Saturday as an integral part of the of the China Mail from 1871 to 1872. This is actually a very interesting case. So I just want to show you an image here. So it's actually the image a bit dark. The resolution is a bit dark because it's actually a copy from a microfilm in Chinese University Library. So you see this kind of a very usual English kind of broadsheet kind of papers layout, and or as with a lot of other kind of daily newspapers, it actually emphasized a lot of the shipping news or international news advertisements. So you can see it's kind of targeted at the more, at the traders and merchants. And so these are all on the right-hand corners, all these kind of shipping news. But the most interesting thing is that it's actually from 1871 to 1872. Out of the 8 pages of newspaper on page 3, they actually insert. So they have another name here. It's actually a Chinese newspaper and have a name that is different from China Mail. So here I just I think it's the Zoom kind of screen kind of, yeah, here. So this is actually the Chinese newspaper printed every Saturday as an integral part of the China Mail. And I'm quite struck by this one because you won't expect that. I first encountered this when I'm kind of looking at the microfilm. And then later I searched for more information. And then I realized this is actually a Hong Kong historian who have commented on this phenomenon before, because it's not something that I've heard, many people talk about. So I kind of quite curious about that. And Elizabeth Sin is one of the Hong Kong historians, and then she mentioned why this paper has for a long time remained obscured. A possible reason why the newspaper has been largely overlooked for so long is that it's buried in the middle of an English language newspaper. Historians who read the English parts of the newspaper would mostly not be interested in the Chinese parts, and Chinese scholars would not have thought of seeking a Chinese newspaper inside an English one. It is not of a separate entity. It also has not been separately catalogued in libraries. I think the last line is very important, actually, because it actually shows us how the infrastructure of the paper has actually impacted on its searchability on subsequent archival system, which of course in turn influence and shaped and impact on on researchers who try to perhaps if they try to just use some keywords or to search for it, they won't be able to find it. And the interesting part about this publication is that it only lasts from 1871 to 72, and starting from April 1872, this paper was published separately as an independent paper under a new name, Chinese Mail, a move that reflects the growing demands of Chinese readers and also the wish of the editors and journalists in having a greater control of the editorial direction of the Chinese newspaper. And this Chinese paper is kind of interesting because it's actually, when reading the content, you see it's pretty in line and coincide with the overall so-called cosmopolitan outlook of the China Mail. Most of the reports you see, these are different reports, are actually translated news of other countries, and there were only not many local reports. But it's true that they actually tried to narrate the narratives based more from the perspective of the Chinese community of the time. But I also want to kind of briefly mention that although I use the term non-intersecting plane worlds, because as you can see, it's not just about readership, but I suppose even in contemporary researchers, the way we think about scholarship sometimes perhaps might also think about the Chinese press and English press as two different kind of research areas. But I also want to mention that it doesn't mean that, the editors and the journalists who were involved in these papers were unaware of the broader media landscape. And the earlier newspaper, actually earlier than this one, there's the missionary-supported Chinese journal, Chinese serial called Chinese serial. I kind of thought it's nice to put everything here, on one slide. Sorry, it might be a bit confusing, but um, just to show you, of course, we talk a little bit about the China Mail, the China Punch here, also ends. And then this one, here is the one that I just mentioned, 1874, the Universal Circulating Parade. And this one is actually the earliest I think, Chinese newspaper, but it's supported by a missionary, Morrison Education Society. And that's why many people, if they mainly talk about more kind of commercially run, they don't regard this one as the first one. But in any case, the reason why I want to mention that is because Universal Circulating Parades editor, the first editor at least, is actually Wang Tou, who is regarded as one of the most cosmopolitan Chinese intellectuals during the period, and he had also traveled to and written about different places overseas, including Japan, London, and Paris. He also played an important role in facilitating missionary and psychologist James Lake in translating ancient Chinese words in English. And so I kind of mentioned that because you can actually see that, the more kind of cosmopolitan outlook of the editors and the writers. So I just want to mention this to say that I want to qualify the statements about not intersecting plain words a bit more, because I mainly refer to the readerships of the time. And so reading a clause, if you might remember, still remember the subtitle for this session is Reading a Clause and Beyond. And so reading a clause to me actually signifies that after reading a clause, periodicals that might not have often been brought together for discussion, even though they were also being produced roughly within the Victorian period as commonly construed. And of course, as I briefly mentioned earlier, even though for Chinese press, it was the reign of the Qing emperor that was the historical and temporal point of reference. Reading beyond, however, indicates an attempt to engage with periodicals that were published outside the Victorian period in recognition of the different historical time frame and different categories in societies, even though they might be in different ways shaped or influenced by colonial society. Reading beyond, I think, is also an attempt to explore possible frameworks of analysis that could potentially go beyond the usual dichotomies, such as those related to the margin versus center, colonizer versus colonized, that have often been used to discuss colonial periodical publications. In tracing the development of Anglophone periodicals in Hong Kong, especially illustrated journals, literary magazines, and creative works published in newspapers, which is, as mentioned earlier, is my major focus in my research, actually, even though today I kind of brought them up, it has become obvious that there had been increasing emphasis on so-called local voices, though it often refers to the ones that could give a local color to the place, or I suppose, insider's perspective on the place that was under depiction. And one of the examples is the short story series Chronicles of a Crown Colony by James Dossio that published in South China Morning Post that is still actually running today. And it's in fact the paper that I worked for before I became an academic from 1967. By using a Chinese pen name Xinshang, Dossio seemed to have intended to project an insider's point of view. Indeed, his stories demonstrate a much greater engagement with the various forms of explicit and implicit racial and spatial boundaries that conditioned colonial life that works in earlier publications. And this is actually published, as you can see, as a supplement. So I kind of alluded to it earlier, there's kind of the certain kind of liminality sometimes associated with creative works published in newspapers. In a review in Daily News, I also stated on this slide, he was described as having some of the qualities of the earlier Mr. Kipling, again, drawing reference to, of course, some of the major English writers of colonial society, yet he drew criticism from Shanghai Times, which described him as hiding under the cloak of anonymity when writing his stories. Despite demonstrating a greater awareness of the different racial and spatial boundaries and the possible transgression, many of his stories still cannot go beyond the framework of the colonial narratives of absence. That is to say, non-English characters or Chinese characters very often fail to have a voice in the stories. To uncover voices in the city, then, one cannot but look for sources that go beyond Victorian periodicals, and this is going to be my last few slides and the last part. A few locally produced periodicals, especially those that were inspired by the literary revolution in the May 4th movement in China in 1919, that promoted the use of vernacular language in writing rather than classical Chinese, that was actually used in some of the Chinese texts that I showed you in previous slides, emerged in the 1920s in Hong Kong. These were publications that also emphasized self-expression and literary experimentation. I just want to mention two. I just show you the slide and then so these are two literary magazines. One is called Iron Horse, 1929, and On the Island, 1930. They also engage with questions of making place and culture. They represented attempts by young writers from Hong Kong to promote new literature while also expressing the visions of the world that was much inspired by the different literary works, including British, French, and of course, new literary movements in modern Shanghai that they chanced to read and admired. And I want to draw attention to the fact that they named the journal on the right On the Island and also formed a literary group of the same name in the 1920s, which I think reflects the place-based literary consciousness and subjectivity that go beyond the national framework of reference that English and Chinese press respectively promoted in the earlier decades that I mentioned. In the inaugural issue of On the Island, one of the members, Zhe Guang, wrote, I once expresses my translation disbelief in the fate of our acquaintance, talking about other group members actually and other like-minded young writers. After miles of traveling, we arrived in this isolated island, meeting each other while drifting in the sea of thousands of people. If you say this is fate, I don't believe it, but it's really not an easy thing to do. The image evoked by the literary group of the island evokes feeling of isolation, chance encounters, unexpected affiliations. In the context of early 20th century Hong Kong, the isolation that these young writers felt had motivated them to develop their own voice and create a writerly identity that could connect to, yet also distinguish them from Britain, China, and other cities and cultures from which they drew inspiration. Crucially, their writings also engaged with the ways of life, places, and spaces that were seldom represented in English periodicals throughout the long 19th century. For example, while the Peak District, as mentioned earlier, as can encapsulate in Austin N's cover image, regularly appeared in creative works and Anglophone periodicals that assumed the target reader's familiarity with the local. For this group of young writers, these were but luxurious spaces that were much distant from their everyday experience. These periodicals were short-lived because they were in lack of funding and resources to sustain their publication. But putting them together with illustrated journals and magazines that I drew reference to at the beginning of this talk, I think could complicate our understanding of the idea of modernity and the development of print culture in the city. For writers, journalists, and editors of Victorian periodicals that were established in Hong Kong from the mid-19th to the early 20th centuries, the idea of plain modernities was often being configured explicitly or implicitly as part of the British imperial modernization projects in the Far East. That's why the success or failure of the endeavors was frequently measured against those that were practiced in Britain, or the very broadly construed, very generalized notion of the West. For the young writers who sought to establish their ideal periodicals, albeit short-lived in the city in the 1920s and 30s, periodical publication and the idea of the modern was a means for them to develop their literary styles and to reclaim their own voice from within the culture of the place that they called home, even though their vision of the world was unavoidably, or perhaps more accurate to say, naturally shaped by the Chinese and the English print worlds, as well as those from elsewhere, given Hong Kong's history. So I think it's nice, as you can see, I kind of building up the image actually from earlier, and then now I put everything kind of together, including these illustrated journals. So my concluding remark is that as I continue reading beyond Victorian periodicals, one of the questions that emerged is how I'm going to situate these kinds of periodicals within or in relation to the broader field of Victorian studies. And of course, part of that reflection is because I was trained as kind of Victorianist as the starting point, and then I kind of move along the historical period and field of research. And at the end, I've come to the realization that the answer to that, perhaps, is less about how to redefine or expand the idea of Victorian periodicals, but rather how we can put different periodicals in productive dialogues with each other so as to explore broader questions relating to modernity and its limits, as different voices continue to compete for attention through different clean spaces at specific moments in history. The act of making and unmaking literary histories in this sense then is always a dialectical process that is never complete, as every new or rediscovered historical material approach is bound to shape or reshape our understanding of the past, the present, and possibly the future. So thank you. I think it's a bit longer than I thought. And thank you very much for your patience. And it's the image that showed the images of the archival materials that I'm using for today. So thank you again for having me today. And any feedback and questions are very much welcome.
Claudia, I don't know. Claudia, can you hear me?
No, I can't hear you.
Okay, wait. Can you hear me now?
Oh, now it's fine.
So could you end your slideshow, please? And then
sorry.
I'm going to try to
fine.
see. It's Preeti here who's trying to run tech, which is never a good idea because Preeti is not a Mac user, and this is with somebody who uses a Mac. Please come up. Yes, I'm trying to get us off. I'm trying to get us off and to get us on presenter view so Claudia can see the room.
Oh.
I should not have said. There we go. Multi-speaker. Multi-speaker.
No.
No.
Maybe someone else.
Well,
gallery?
No.
Do you want to see non-video participants or?
Well, I want Claudia to see us.
Okay.
But all speakers? Can we do speakers up there? No, that's a speaker.
Non-video participants? No.
No. Well, Claudia, we're trying to figure out how you can see us. Can you see us at all?
I can actually see us. You mean you or the audience? Because I can see the audience.
Oh, you can see the audience?
Yeah, I can see them.
Oh, great. Oh, okay. Okay,
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, they are always. I mean, they're always on the screen actually.
Right. I mean, we're tiny little, tiny little squares. Okay, you can hear us then. So,
I can.
Hello, everybody. Sorry about that little tech glitch. We do have microphones. You have to. Yeah, you got it on. We have microphones, and Mary's not here. Allison, could I have you be the other runner, please? So we thank you, Claudia, for that. Really, there's a text going around where somebody said just dazzling plenary. Thank you for that wonderful, wonderful talk. We have half an hour for questions and comments and discussions, and I'm already seeing a hand. Kathy back there, so we'll do runner mics, and Claudia will let us know if you can or cannot hear the sound here. We were able to hear you great and see you great, but Kari had to step out, so I'm trying to troubleshoot. Okay, go for it, Kathy.
Hi, Claudia. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Okay? Yeah. Hi, Kathy. Hello.
Kathy.
Kathy, can I just ask folks to just say who they are? I think that might help. Or would it be helpful if people stood up and asked their questions so you can kind of see generally where they are in the audience? Claudia?
Oh, yeah, I can see.
There we go.
Yeah, thanks. Hello, yes.
Hi, Claudia. Thank you so much. Fascinating talk. I wanted to ask you about the China Mail's inclusion of the Chinese language newspaper within the English language newspaper, whether you know any more about what the editors thought they were doing with that. What were they aiming for? To increase circulation? Is there any commentary in the newspaper about why, you know, it moving between those two different language texts? It's fascinating, and I'd also like to know about the I mean, how physically, materially they were able to do that with different, I mean, how did they typeset something like that? Was it yeah, anyway, if you could say any more about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks very much for the question. Yeah. That's actually a great, fascinating question about how they type it. Actually, I haven't figured out that one, but I can answer the first kind of question. They actually appointed a Chinese person, Chen. I mean, I use Cantonese now, Chen, I think, who's to basically as the chief editor of the Chinese paper. And when the paper was first launched, you know, he did kind of write the editorial for the first issue of the Chinese paper, saying that you know, I think that he wanted to so-called give, he really used the word give voices to the Chinese community. But as I mentioned earlier, you know, the whole editorial direction of the Chinese paper is actually constrained or aligned with, you know, the English, you know, the main paper, the China Mail. And this particular person, you know, is also very interesting. He's actually received education in St. Paul's College, which is in Hong Kong. It's more kind of a so-called westernized kind of education. And so I think there's some kind of some biographical notes that suggested that the reason why he could earn the trust, you know, of the English editors of the time is because I think of his educational background, and he's also, I suppose he's also pretty noted, I think, within the circle of the time. So I think from his perspective, is the goal is to give voices to the Chinese community. But I think from the China Mail perspective, there's also a brief kind of note that kind of mentioned they would like to respond to the growing demand of the Chinese kind of readers, you know, in the city. And so, so I think these are what's probably, you know, kind of explain the publication. And I also want to add that China Mail is not the only newspaper to do that. The other one is the Daily Press, have also tried doing something similar, you know, at around a similar time too. Yeah, thanks very much for the question. And I really like the question about how to type it too. So I think I need to kind of find out more about the information about that once, you know, because you can, as you can see, the characters are really dense as well. At that point, they didn't use punctuation in Chinese Cantonese. So anyway, so yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Yevhan. I study history at the University of Oxford, and thank you for your fascinating talk. I'm intrigued by your remark about the the imagined community, sort of shared interest in British writings that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, meaning that there was a translation of Britain-based authors in these Chinese newspapers and periodicals. But I wonder whether the British from the core contributed to the Chinese newspaper. So whether there was any sort of reciprocity in this sort of imagined community of readers and writers, or was it like more one-sided process when we have only like translations of the British authors in these Chinese newspapers and the periodicals, and follow up on that question. So whether it was like whether my question is like whether British writers and other authors like journalists contributed to the Chinese newspapers based in Hong Kong, and second question based on that would be, did the authors in Britain itself, so like in the core, somehow responded to the texts that appeared in the periodicals in the Hong Kong that you been studying? Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sorry, I think the last, sorry, because the microphone is actually, the volume is quite a bit low here. So can I clarify whether you're asking whether there's any translations of British writers in Chinese papers? Is it the question?
We're going to try the other mic. Was
yeah,
the other
that
mic
would be
better?
really helpful.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll shorten my question.
Oh, this one is great. Yeah, sorry, I should have asked a bit earlier. Yeah, this one is great. Yeah, it's much louder. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Perfect. So my question is whether the British authors contributed to these English-speaking newspapers in Hong Kong. So that there was not the translations, but like British authors themselves contributing to these newspapers. And on that, did the authors based in Britain responded to the text, or maybe like reviewed the text or read the text that were published in these periodicals that you've been studying? So this are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the questions. And actually, most of the illustrated papers and newspapers, they actually, I think two kind of writings they usually publish if we talk about creative writing or literary writings. And firstly is that they usually reprint short stories, by British writers, is the usual tactic. For example, odds and ends, actually, for each of the issue, they publish short stories, including George Sims' short story, actually in odds and ends as well. The other type of writers they kind of use are those more kind of amateur. Usually, this kind of expatriates. I don't know. For example, James Darcy that I mentioned at the end of the presentation, he's actually lived in Hong Kong for a while. And so he's actually the kind of writers who's actually start earning his name when they start writing, for Hong Kong newspapers. So these are not the famous one initially, at least. It's more like amateur as the starting point. So I think periodicals, at that point in Hong Kong actually provides platform for these, little known writers, or to give them an opportunity, to publish their works. But I think most of the, as I mentioned earlier, like South China Weekly Post or Austin Ends, they actually reprint, some of the short stories and materials from English writers directly. So they don't use translations per se because these are Anglophone periodicals, right? So they're, do you see what I mean? I hope I addressed your questions. Or...
Hi, I'm Margaret Stetz, and thank you for your talk. I'm keen on humor. But shame on me, I did not know about the China Punch. And we all know about the politics of Punch, geared toward the middle classes, very conservative, making fun of the avant-garde. What is the China Punch like in its targeting and its approach to humor and its politics? I'd love to hear more. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much. China Punch, so can I share the slide again? Because I have this one slide have the illustrated image.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's just.
So I think this actually image on the right kind of exemplify quite a bit. I think in China Punch, there's quite a lot of the so-called, it depends on how you see it, right? Kind of use the sense of humor to kind of make fun of quite a lot of Chinese customs. And Chinese people basically, so I think it's kind of like a very satirical portrayal. For example, this is make fun of the Chinese dynasty and the emperor and the customs of the time. So I think so I think this is the one of the major, I suppose, the strategy or the rhetorical or the humorous representation. So this is the, let me bottom. Oh, sorry. And of course, they also comment on some current events. But I think in terms of the images, you see quite a few of these. Oh, sorry, I can't go back. You see quite a few of these images, like this one here on the right hand side. So I think it's kind of encapsulate quite a bit of the direction of the China Punch of the time. And that's why, in the archive, in the Baptist University of Hong Kong library, they describe it as more the kind of colonial point of view of thinking about the Sino-British relations, or in terms of the way to think about Chinese people and culture of the time.
Hi, Claudia. I'm Sarah. I want to add my thanks to everyone else for giving such a fantastic talk to open. 1 second. Let me just adjust
I'm sorry.
Yes, Claudia, there's a next question. It's from Sarah, and I'm going to adjust the volume on your, try that now, Sarah.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry, I just stopped sharing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, go for it, Sarah.
Hello. Okay. I'm really curious if you could say more about your sense of the circulation of the different periodicals that you are looking at. Like, are you noticing that the periodicals that are appearing in Chinese are receiving higher circulation rates versus ones that are trying to give this hybrid English-Chinese pairing, or if the papers with the most circulation tended to be the ones that are written in English, targeted at English audiences? So if you could just say a little bit maybe about your sense of how these papers are circulated and to what degree the different audiences they're targeting seem to be interested in reading them, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for the questions. And I have to say that I cannot give you a definite or exact number at this point. So some of the Chinese blog sheets that I mentioned today, they're actually some of the new kind of area that I'm kind of covering. But I can give you a general sense because I think it's also you're right that today I did actually include quite a range of papers. And especially in terms of the illustrated, so I start with illustrated journals and then daily press. Okay, for the illustrated journals that I mentioned, Austin Ends or China Punch or China Magazine, and those are or MapPi, those were really short-lived. So I think I think I can't give you an exact number, but according to the editorials, the circulation number is really small because they only target at a very small number of residents, in Hong Kong who were interested in illustrated, journals or literature or English literature, for example. But then for the daily newspapers, I can give you a reference for South China Morning Post even in 1903, when it was first established. I recall the figures is only around 300 or 400 in the 100. So it's actually, I'm talking about 1903, so the number is really small. But I believe that, China Mail, in the earlier decades, because China Mail is one of the longest running periodicals, in English. And the target audience is actually, a lot of them are traders, merchants. So it's actually include people outside Hong Kong as well. And you can also see that even for English newspapers, they also, I mean, from abroad, they sometimes will often also reference, like the Daily Press from Hong Kong or even China Mail. So I think it's a bit hard to ascertain the exact readership in that sense because there's a certain kind of transnational readership. And also, if you might recall, the front page of China Mail very often is actually shipping news, is actually put on the front page. So it's actually showed the major purpose of the papers is really for trading and shipping. And it's only in the inside pages where we can see other news items, for example. And so I think for that one, it's probably explaining why it's much longer running. And China Mail is also interesting. When it was first established, it was the only paper that can publish government gazette as well. So there's a lot of some of the research kind of suggested that this actually have a support, not only commercially, but it seems the government might also support it as well. For a few years, it's the only paper who could publish the government gazette. So I think it can kind of give you a brief sense of the circulation. This range is quite it's quite diverse, I think, at that point.
We still have plenty of time for questions. Okay, I see one over there, one over there. Okay.
Thank you. My apologies. Hi, Claudia. Thank you
Hello.
so much for how fantastic that was. Really interesting. My name's Morgan. I am a grad student at the University of Minnesota. And this past year, I took a class on archival practices. So I've become very interested in the ways that we archive, periodicals and how that affects the kind of research that is produced. And I'm thinking about the Chinese mail and the English and Chinese versions, and how you said that the Chinese section in it sort of has for a while fallen through the cracks because it's all like it's all archived under an English newspaper, so people don't know to look for it. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how colonial archiving practices or like library science practices affect this kind of like multicultural, multilingual research and the kinds of knowledge that produced?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's also I think it's a question that all of us confront. I think even if you're mainly focusing on, for example, British periodicals, there's also the question, right, sometimes about whether some of the more obscure one, where can you find them, or then maybe some newspapers like South China Morning Post. Actually, I've been very interested in the archive, and it's also digitalized, on the ProQuest platform, and yet there's still a few years of the papers were missing because during the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, the office of SMP was destroyed or burned, as it were. And so it's actually, I've been tracing some creative writings that were published during that period, which I knew it was in existence, but I couldn't access it anymore because the archive was not complete. So I think it's just one instance that show that I think whether it's not just about language. I think it's the idea of archive is always a challenge. That might also be the reason why it's kind of exciting, right? When you uncover something, you kind of thought, wow, that's great. So you kind of get it. So I think that's the excitement of doing archival research at the same time. So in response to your question, and this is something that I've also been reflecting a lot. The reason why I use making and unmaking literary history, I think part of it is also my own reflection as well. Because I do feel that, I'm also participating in the making and unmaking of history. In giving a presentation or in thinking about literary history of Hong Kong, for example. And I have to admit that, I think part of the major reasons behind quite a lot of periodical research that I've been doing in the past, actually quite a few years, is because of my quest to actually understand more. Is there any voices in cultures, within Hong Kong that I can uncover amidst all these different dynasties, the British Empire, the Chinese Empire, and stuff like that. And so it's been the quest. So I have specific focus of attention, when I try to think about what archive that I can use. So the last slide, the second last one, I suppose, I showed the archival systems that I've been using. And the exploratory study that I mentioned at the starting point, that the exploratory, what is the name again? Sorry. I think all of us are very familiar, right? So the periodicals of Queen Victoria's Empire and Exploration. The first time when I saw it, I was actually very impressed and surprised by the fact that it's actually mentioned Hong Kong as well, because I always thought that, there's not to, anyway. And I think in its actually they mentioned there seems to be a lack of system in Hong Kong about archival research. But I think the situation is actually not that there's not a system, but the fact that if you want to compose all these so-called different languages and cultures, you need to go beyond Hong Kong in any way. So British Library actually holds quite a range of materials in Hong Kong, relating to Hong Kong in the 19th century. And under the colonial government, for example, a lot of the books and periodicals, especially books, if they were published in Hong Kong, they need to be recorded under the register of books. I forgot the exact title, right? So there's also in the time, I try to read the advertisement, on newspapers and trying to trace, some of the history of the publication as well. So I think British Library is also one of the major systems. But as I mentioned earlier, I need to go beyond that as well, especially if I also want to engage with Hong Kong materials. So Hong Kong libraries and libraries in Australia, National, University of Australia also have a very good library. And so I try to kind of, so I suppose the difficulty is that I need to decide which ones I'm going to use and to choose. I think in the process, I feel I'm also constructing something, right? Because I need to be selective because at the end of the day, it depends on whether I can really access the materials. So as I mentioned earlier, even though I want to access some of the stories at CMP during those Japanese occupation years, I can no longer do that. So I suppose I think the key thing just to acknowledge, what is our limitations, and what kind of histories that we are going to show. And so I suppose my concluding remarks to think about, making and remaking is always an incomplete process. It's actually in that sense as well. Because today I'm sharing these materials, but perhaps a year from now, I will be able to read more and to uncover more materials. And then I might have a different understanding of the history that I actually try to understand, right? So I think that's always the kind of the process, as well. So thanks very much, for the question. It's quite a long answer for that.
We haven't.
Oh, a hand over here. I can't remember who the hand was that I saw before. Yes. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I had a small question about the.
Hang on. I think Claudia might be having trouble hearing. Can
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
Claudia and Beatrice, can you hear
Yes,
me?
slightly louder would be great.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, just a small question about the price. How much did they sell? How was the cost of these periodicals, and how were they financed? Because apparently with such a small circulation, they were not financially viable. Did they sell newsagents? Did they have subscribers? How did it work? And did they have financial support from Britain or from individual companies? How did it work financially?
Yeah, okay. So thanks very much, for the question. Let me see whether I can show you the slide. Sorry, just give me a second. So as I mentioned earlier, for some like MapPy, the one that I mentioned earlier. So, oh, sorry, I think I closed the slide. I'm sorry, just give me 1 second. So for MapPy, it's actually interesting for English not illustrated or literary magazines. For example, MapPy, that is the one that I didn't kind of mention explicitly. This is actually kind of more like privately funded. They didn't unveil the sources, but I believe that these are some of the friends kind of put together the resources to fund them. And it's the same as, some of the literary journals, even in the Chinese literary journals that I have mentioned. And that's why those were not, financially viable. Some of the larger scaled, kind of odds and ends, it was sold. So I want to show you the cover page that also, sorry, give me 1 second. They also mentioned the codes as well, because I can't recall very clearly, but I will try to, it's on the cover page. Let's see. Here, the cover page.
Do you need to be sharing something?
Sorry, you can't see anything.
We're not
yet.
seeing your slides
We can
yet.
just see
Yeah.
your
Oh,
face
yeah,
looking for
sorry.
something.
Yeah. No, because I actually, sorry, I can post something somewhere, but I couldn't find it yet. So, oh yeah, I can find it now. Sorry, I'm going to share the screen now. Okay, sorry
Okay,
for
great.
the delay.
Your screen is coming. There we
Oh,
go.
we can see it.
See it there. Yes.
Can you see it now?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
So the problem about these magazines is that, there's the subscription fee, but because it's so short-lived too, so I'm not sure how they're going to resolve that. It's kind of $5, here. There's the course here. I think a little bit, I have to admit that, for the course, I need a bit more time to ascertain them, because I think the difficulty that I find is that there's indeed some subscription fees involved, but very often, especially these short-lived periodicals, they actually stop running quite soon. So I'm not sure financially how they resolve the issue. So I think I need a bit more, research to ascertain, the subscription. But most of the journals and newspapers are kind of subscription. But as I mentioned, for journals like the MapPy, actually the only copy that I could find is from the British Library. Those were kind of privately circulated. Privately means that, as I said, some friends put together funding. So these are quite exceptional. But in terms of English literary magazines, it did exist of the time. So sorry, cannot provide further information on that. So next round, do further research, can provide more information. Really grateful for the question, because I think for the course and all these things, it's a little bit require a bit more, with time to figure it out as well. So thanks.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you so much, Claudia. I'm Gigi Tan. I'm a postdoc from University College. So as I was listening to your talk, I was wondering how common it was for authors based in Hong Kong to publish in newspapers in elsewhere, like in the Strait Colonies and Australia and New Zealand, just in order to have a better outreach of the audience.
Sorry, because the audio is not very clear. So are you saying?
Because in your talk, you mentioned the limited outreach of Hong Kong newspaper. So I was wondering whether some authors who were based in Hong Kong, they actually chose to publish elsewhere, material directly related to the experience in Hong Kong, but they chose to publish in elsewhere in order to have more readers.
Yeah, so I think one of the examples is Kipling, right? From sea to sea, you know, and of course, you know, I think in the 19th century, Sarah Grant actually, one of the story called, oh, I can't remember. This one is relating to typhoons, and the other is, I forgot the exact name. Sorry, it's actually with a Chinese man as the Chinese servant name as the title. Sarah Grant and Kipling, of course, these are some of the examples. There's also a range of, you know, travel writers who've been passing by, you know, Hong Kong, and then write about Hong Kong's experience, and then publish to an English audience, you know, back in England. So I think there's certainly, yeah, I think I'm always struck by the fact that it's quite you know, a space where, you know, quite a few of different authors come to Hong Kong. So I think it's quite usual. And even James Dorsey, the author that I mentioned in the early 20th century, 1936 to 7, and he was in Hong Kong in the early 20th century. And the works that he published in South China Morning Post was later repackaged as a collection and reissued actually in England as well. So I think there's always a bit of the transnational readership and publication scene as well. Yeah, thanks very much for the question. A good reminder of the fact that, of course, you know, there's also certain kind of transnational traffic and cross-cultural encounters that's taking place. And I think there's a question here, right?
Yes.
So we have one, ooh, that's really loud.
Yeah,
We
why
have
suddenly
one
so
final
loud?
question from Laurel Brake, who is on Zoom. Laurel, could you unmute yourself and possibly show yourself or stay a name on a black screen, whatever you prefer, and share your question?
Hi. My question is, I was fascinated about infrastructure and your thoughts on that, as well as the whole paper. But my question is, who owned the China Mail? And was the Chinese insert owned by them? And then when that insert became, as I understood you, independent, what did the owner of, who was the owner of that new title? And was it related in any way to the China Mail?
That's great. Thank you very much. You know, China Mayors actually have a fascinating history. He's actually published by Andrew Shortridge. Do you know Andrew Shortridge? So maybe do you want me to type in the chat box? Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's actually Andrew Shortridge, so it's a very you know, veteran British publisher
I see.
of the time, you know,
All
and I
right.
think yeah, so this actually China Mail was published by is a very famous, I mean, very kind of veteran British publisher of the time, so sorry, the question is about, oh yeah, when the Chinese newspaper, when it was inserted in China Mail, is still controlled, you know, by the British publisher. And that's why, you know, the editorial of the Chinese paper remained the same. I mean, not remain the same, kind of aligned, you know, with the editorial direction of the China Mail, the newspaper, because they're under the same publisher of the time.
And when it became, and when it became independent, who owned it then?
Yeah,
You said
that's a great. Yeah, sure. Sorry, yeah. So when it became independent, and then it's kind of, as mentioned, is edited by Chen Aiting. So that's the kind of the Chinese editor of the time. But I mean, in terms of the ownership, is actually oh, let's see. Sorry, let me take a look.
Claudia, could you type those names into the chat just so that listeners
You mean
can
the
see
Chinese
how they're
person?
spelled?
Okay, yes, sorry, yes.
Thank you. Oh, yes. Thank you.
Is it the...
There we go. We've got them. Thank you.
Okay.
Don't know what I did here.
Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Great.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so we're at the end of our time, and I want to thank Klaudia for a really, really wonderful paper, and for all of our questioners for some vibrant questions that brought out the talk in more complexity. Thank you so much for Klaudia for staying up so late. I mean, I know it's like almost midnight there now. And thank you for taking the time to speak with us. So thank you, everyone. Let's give her a round of applause.
Yes, thank you very much for all the questions as well. They're really helpful, and I think there's a lot of work to be done on this topic as well. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so I go offline, or
Claudia, you want to say something? Go ahead. Go ahead, Claudia.
No. I think I finished. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for the questions.
I mean, this is unscripted, but I have about 9,000 questions for you personally. So I'm just going to be writing you emails, and I'm sure others will too. But thank you so very, very much. And we'll have coffee here, and we will see. And nice to see you, Laurel, and other friends. So take care. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Okay, enjoy the rest of the conference. Okay, thank you.